The story does not begin with a speech, a gunshot, or a decoration. It begins under fluorescent lights. The hum is constant. The air smells faintly of dust and metal. Long aisles stretch forward, but they lead nowhere. Shelves stand empty, their metal ribs exposed like bones. A small crowd waits in silence. People clutch paper cards, folded and unfolded until the edges soften. No one knows what will arrive today. Bread, maybe. Soap, if they are lucky. Perhaps nothing at all. This is not chaos. This is routine. And that is what makes it dangerous. We are taught that the Soviet Union collapsed because of politics, ideology, or sudden rebellion. The truth is colder. Empires do not always fall from the top. Sometimes they dissolve from the checkout counter backward. For decades, power had been measured in missiles, factories, and maps. The Soviet state could move armies across continents. It could build cities from frozen ground. It could send machines beyond the atmosphere. Yet here in a neighborhood store, it could not deliver basic goods. Meat, shoes, detergent. Think about that. When a system can command physics but not logistics, something fundamental has failed. This was not an inconvenience. It was a signal, a quiet one, repeated daily, telling millions of people that the future was no longer guaranteed. Authority depends on expectation. Tomorrow must feel predictable. Wages must matter. Money must convert into food. When that chain breaks, belief begins to leak out. People adapted at first. They always do. Lines became part of life. Waiting was normal. Conversations shifted to rumors of deliveries and whispers of backrooms. The state did not see rebellion. It saw patience. But patience is not loyalty. It is endurance. And endurance has limits. Every empty shelf carried a message that no speech could erase. The system no longer understood demand. It no longer knew value. It no longer translated effort into reward. Once people sensed that, everything else started to feel optional. Rules without results become suggestions. Laws without bread become noise. This chapter asks a dangerous question. How does a superpower lose authority without losing a war? There were no invading armies here. No foreign flags raised over capitals. The borders remained intact. The institutions stood. The uniforms were worn. Yet something essential was slipping away. The answer does not begin in parliaments or party halls. It begins in kitchens where meals shrink. It begins in queues where hours stretch longer than hope. It begins in cold streets where people learn that survival depends less on policy than on luck. When daily life stops working, ideology becomes abstract, and abstraction cannot fill a stomach. Economics is often described as numbers and charts. In reality, it is trust made visible. It is the promise that effort today leads to security tomorrow. In the Soviet system, that promise was once strong. Jobs were guaranteed. Housing was provided. Prices were fixed. Money did not need to be flexible because the state absorbed the risk. But that arrangement only works when supply keeps pace with need. When it does not, the promise becomes hollow. People still receive wages, but wages lose meaning. Prices stay low, but shelves stay empty. This is worse than inflation. At least inflation admits scarcity. Empty stores deny it. Imagine standing in line before dawn. The store doors are locked. No sign explains what will arrive or when. People bring stools, thermoses, blankets. Time is spent not producing, but waiting. This waiting becomes an unpaid tax. Hours that could build, repair, or innovate are consumed by uncertainty. The economy bleeds through inefficiency, one queue at a time. Multiply that across millions of citizens, across years, across generations. The cost is enormous, yet invisible in official reports. Output targets do not measure exhaustion. 5-year plans do not account for frustration. The shelves did not empty overnight. They thinned slowly. First, choices narrowed. Then substitutions became normal. Then absence replaced variety. The state spoke of temporary disruptions. People heard permanence. When explanations repeat without resolution, trust erodes. And when trust erodes, people adapt in ways the system cannot control. They hoard when goods appear. They trade privately. They favor relationships over rules. Informal networks replace official channels. None of this looks like rebellion. It looks like survival. But survival outside the system weakens the system itself. An empire survives not by force alone, but by coordination. Millions of strangers must cooperate daily without knowing each other. Money is the language that makes this possible. It signals scarcity. It directs labor. It rewards efficiency. When that language breaks, coordination collapses. The Soviet ruble still existed. Wages were still paid. Prices were still printed. But the connection between money and goods was fraying. Money could not command reality. It could not summon bread to a shelf. That is a fatal weakness. When currency loses its power, authority soon follows. The state tried to reassure. Production numbers were announced. Success was declared. But lived experience contradicted official reality. And lived experience always wins. A person who cannot find food does not care about steel output. A parent who waits all day for milk does not believe growth statistics. This gap between announcement and experience became a chasm. Every empty shelf widened it. Over time, people stopped listening. Not out of defiance, but out of irrelevance. The system spoke a language no one recognized anymore. Think about the psychological shift this creates. When effort does not improve outcome, motivation fades. When rules do not deliver security, compliance weakens. People stop planning long-term. They focus on today, on securing tomorrow's meal, on navigating uncertainty. This shortens horizons. An economy without long-term planning cannot sustain complexity. It retreats into maintenance mode. It preserves structures without renewing them. That is how decline hides inside stability. Empty shelves were not accidents. They were outcomes. They revealed a system that prioritized control over feedback. Decisions traveled downward. Information struggled to travel upward. Bad news was often delayed or ignored. By the time shortages became visible, they were already embedded. Fixing them required flexibility the system did not allow. Adjusting prices threatened ideology. Admitting scarcity threatened legitimacy. So denial continued. And denial is expensive. Each visit to a store became a small referendum, not on ideology, but on competence. Could the system deliver? Could it respond? Could it adapt? Day after day, the answer felt the same. No, not here, not now, maybe next week, maybe next year. That uncertainty drained loyalty more effectively than any speech. People did not need to be persuaded to doubt. They experienced doubt daily. It was tangible. It was edible or not. This is how power begins to fail quietly. Not with collapse, but with erosion. Not with violence, but with absence. The shelves told a story the state could not rewrite. They said that planning had lost touch with reality, that resources were misallocated, that incentives were broken, that time itself was being wasted. And wasted time is the most corrosive cost of all. You cannot store it. You cannot replace it. You can only lose it. The Soviet Union still looked strong from afar. Flags flew. Parades marched. Maps showed vast territory. But inside its cities, another map was forming. A map of empty spaces, of missing goods, of waiting lines, of informal exchanges. That map mattered more than borders, because it charted daily life. And daily life is where belief lives or dies. By the late years, the question was no longer whether the system could win a war. It was whether it could manage a morning, whether it could stock a shelf, whether it could keep a promise small enough to matter. When those promises fail, grand visions lose weight. Authority becomes theoretical, and theory does not feed people. This chapter is not about failure as spectacle. It is about failure as routine, as repetition, as the slow normalization of absence. The empty store was not just a place. It was a message delivered without words, repeated across an empire. It said the system no longer understood the lives it governed. And once people grasped that, the center cannot hold, not because it is attacked, but because it is no longer needed. The collapse of belief always begins before the collapse of institutions, before borders change, before flags are lowered. It begins when everyday economics stops making sense, when money cannot command goods, when waiting replaces working, when survival depends on adaptation, not policy. That is where the story truly begins. In the quiet hum of lights over empty shelves. For decades, the Soviet system appeared immovable. From the outside, it looked like a machine built to last forever. Factories roared day and night, their chimneys pouring smoke into gray skies. Steel mills glowed red through winter darkness. Trains crawled across thousands of miles of frozen land, hauling coal, grain, timber, and weapons. Everything about the empire suggested momentum. The numbers reinforced the image. Output targets were announced with confidence. Growth was proclaimed in reports and speeches. The state owned the land, the factories, the mines, and the banks. It planned production, controlled prices, and decided who worked where. Nothing seemed left to chance. To many observers, this was strength. That appearance mattered more than most realized. Power depends on perception as much as force. As long as the system looked stable, it felt stable. People did not need abundance. They needed predictability. A guaranteed job, a roof overhead, a fixed price for bread. The ruble did not have to impress foreign markets if it functioned at home. It was not designed to signal value. It was designed to enforce order. Wages were paid. Prices were printed. Losses were hidden inside ministries. When a factory failed, it did not close. It was supported. When production missed targets, the targets were adjusted. The system absorbed inefficiency the way a sponge absorbs water. Subsidies were everywhere. Food, fuel, housing, transport. Each one smoothed daily life while masking real costs. Fixed prices silenced feedback. If something was scarce, the price did not rise to warn planners. It stayed the same and disappeared. Shortages were treated as distribution problems, not signals. This allowed the state to claim success even when reality drifted away. Trade with the outside world was tightly controlled. Imports were selective. Exports were strategic. Oil, gas, and raw materials filled gaps when inefficiency grew. These resources acted like shock absorbers. When productivity lagged, energy exports paid the bill. When factories underperformed, natural wealth covered the difference. For a long time, it worked well enough. People adjusted their expectations. Choice was limited. But security felt solid. Lines were normal. Shortages were joked about. A missing item was an inconvenience, not a crisis. The system traded variety for stability, and many accepted the bargain. The state promised continuity. In return, Citizens surrender flexibility. It was not glamorous, but it felt durable. Think about that. An economy does not need to be loved to survive. It only needs to feel reliable. The illusion of strength was reinforced by scale. The empire was vast. It spanned climates, cultures, and continents. That size created confidence. Surely something this large could not fail quietly. The military paraded. The space program dazzled. Heavy industry dominated skylines. These were visible proofs of capability. They suggested competence, even when daily life contradicted it. Grand projects drew attention away from mundane failures. It is easier to admire a rocket launch than to count missing goods. Inside the system, information traveled upward slowly, if at all. Bad news was softened at each level. No manager wanted to report failure. No ministry wanted to admit shortage. Numbers were adjusted to protect careers. Reports grew optimistic as reality grew harsher. This created a feedback vacuum. Decisions were made based on what should have been happening, not what was. A system that never hears bad news starts believing its own reports, and belief becomes policy. Factories focused on meeting quotas, not satisfying demand. Quantity mattered more than usefulness. A factory that produced 10,000 identical items was successful, even if no one wanted them. Warehouses filled with goods that checked boxes but solved nothing. Meanwhile, items people needed remained scarce. The contradiction was invisible on paper. Production targets were met. Distribution was blamed. Planning remained unquestioned. This separation between output and satisfaction was fatal, but slow. The illusion also depended on time. Each year, the system promised improvement. Next plan, next reform, next adjustment. The future was always just ahead. People learned to wait. Waiting became a habit. A culture of patience formed, reinforced by fear of disruption. Change was risky. Stability, even flawed, felt safer. That fear worked in the system's favor. As long as tomorrow seemed manageable, today could be endured. But beneath the banners and parades, something fragile was forming. The system's strength relied on suppressing signals. It replaced prices with plans, feedback with directives, adaptation with compliance. This works in emergencies. It fails in complexity. Over time, inefficiencies compounded. Resources were misallocated. Energy was wasted. Labor was underused. The cost did not appear in profits or losses. It appeared in time, in waiting, in frustration, in quiet disengagement. Oil and gas delayed the reckoning. Resource exports brought in foreign currency. They paid for imports the system could not produce efficiently. They propped up consumption. But this created dependency. When global conditions shifted, the cushion thinned. The empire's apparent self-sufficiency had reliance on external prices it could not control. Strength built on commodities is strength borrowed from markets, even when ideology denies it. From the outside, the Soviet Union still looked unstoppable. From the inside, people sensed limits. Not collapse, but stagnation. Progress slowed. Promises felt recycled. The future stopped feeling brighter. It felt repetitive. That emotional shift mattered. An economy is not only machines and materials. It is expectations. When expectations flatten, momentum dies. Shortages, once jokes, became routines. Routines became burdens. Burdens became signals. The illusion of strength required silence. It required that people not connect daily inconvenience to systemic failure. For years, they did not. But silence cannot last forever. Reality keeps sending messages. And when those messages are ignored, they grow louder. This chapter is about that illusion, not because it was fake, but because it was incomplete. The system was strong in visible ways and weak in invisible ones. It could build, command, and mobilize. It could not listen. And an economy that cannot listen eventually loses the ability to respond. The shelves had not fully emptied yet, but the mechanisms that would empty them were already in place. Quiet, structural, waiting. The cracks did not arrive with a single shock. They crept in slowly, disguised as inconvenience, softened by habit. Central planners believed they could calculate need from above, that formulas could replace signals. Demand was estimated, not observed. Factories were instructed, not informed. Production followed plans written months or years earlier, frozen in assumptions that no longer matched reality. When people wanted something different, the system did not hear them. It only heard itself. Quotas mattered more than outcomes. Targets mattered more than satisfaction. The economy kept moving, but it stopped learning. Factories responded rationally to irrational rules. Managers focused on fulfilling numeric goals, not usefulness. If a quota demanded weight, they produced heavier items. If it demanded quantity, they simplified designs. Quality slipped because quality was risky. Risk threatened reports. Reports threatened careers. So warehouses filled with goods that checked boxes but solved nothing. Shoes that did not fit. Tools that broke. Appliances that failed quickly. On paper, success multiplied. In stores, absence deepened. This gap widened quietly, protected by bureaucracy and denial. Money began to lose its meaning. Prices were fixed, but availability was not. Wages rose in official terms, yet buying power shrank in practice. People were paid on time for work that felt increasingly pointless. They held currency that could not command goods. This is a dangerous moment in any economy. Money is not valuable because it exists. It is valuable because it moves things. When it stops moving things, it becomes paper. The ruble still circulated, but no longer translated effort into reward. Think about that. An economy where work does not improve life cannot hold loyalty. To cover gaps, the state printed more money. This mass scarcity without solving it. On reports, balances held. In reality, shortages intensified. More rubles chased the same limited goods. Prices could not rise to ration demand, so goods vanished instead. Empty shelves replaced price signals. This forced rationing by waiting. Time became the currency people spent most. Hours in line, days searching, weeks planning around uncertainty. Time is the most unequal tax. Those with connections paid less. Those without paid more. Oil exports had once absorbed inefficiency. Energy sales brought in foreign currency that paid for imports. When productivity faltered, resources filled the hole. But global conditions changed. Prices shifted. Demand fluctuated. Revenues tightened. The cushion thinned. Imports grew harder to afford. Technology lagged. Spare parts became scarce. The system felt the squeeze from outside and inside at once. Foreign currency became precious. Ministries argued over allocations. Choices that had been postponed became unavoidable. Inside government offices, ledgers stopped making sense. Numbers balanced only because assumptions were adjusted. Losses were spread across agencies. Responsibility blurred. No single failure triggered alarm. Instead, many small failures accumulated. Outside those offices, people felt it directly. Lines grew longer. Selection shrank. Quality fell. Black markets expanded quietly, then openly. Informal exchange replaced official distribution. People traded favors, not rubles. Relationships became more valuable than wages. This shift mattered. It meant the state no longer mediated daily survival. This was a turning point. Empty shelves were no longer anomalies. They were evidence. They exposed a core failure. The system could not convert resources into satisfaction. It could move tons of steel, but not breakfast to a table. It could plan output, but not outcomes. An economy that ignores feedback eventually hears only noise. And noise cannot guide decisions. As trust faded, behavior changed. People hoarded when goods appeared, fearing absence tomorrow. Hoarding worsened shortages. Shortages encouraged hoarding. Cause and effect locked together in a loop the system could not break. The psychological shift was profound. When scarcity feels permanent, people stop believing official timelines. Promises of improvement lose weight. Patience turns into cynicism. Cynicism turns into disengagement. Workers do the minimum required. Innovation stalls. Initiative feels pointless. Why solve problems if solutions are ignored? Why work harder if rewards do not change? This quiet withdrawal drained productivity more effectively than any strike. The economy slowed not because people resisted, but because they adapted emotionally. Authority weakened in subtle ways. Rules were still enforced, but selectively. Compliance became situational. People followed regulations that helped them and ignored those that did not. This erosion was hard to measure. It did not show up in crime statistics or protests at first. It appeared in tone, in jokes, in resignation, in the way people spoke about the future. When belief fades, language changes. Optimism disappears. Irony takes its place. Attempt at reform arrived late and cautiously. Adjustments were made at the margins. New incentives were discussed. Minor decentralization was tested, but the core mechanism remained intact. Prices stayed fixed. Feedback stayed filtered. Flexibility stayed limited. Partial reforms exposed contradictions without resolving them. They raised expectations the system could not meet. This made disappointment sharper. When change is promised and delayed, frustration intensifies. The gap between rhetoric and reality widens faster. Think about the scale of this failure. It was not one policy or one leader. It was a structure built to suppress uncertainty. That structure excelled at mobilization. It failed at adaptation. In stable conditions, it appeared strong. In changing conditions, it became brittle. Small stresses accumulated until rigidity turned into fragility. The economy did not collapse under pressure. It hollowed out from within. Every empty shelf carried weight beyond its contents. It told people that effort might not be rewarded, that planning might be detached from reality, that waiting might be permanent. Over time, these messages reshaped behavior. People invested less in the system and more in themselves, in family, in networks, in exit strategies, mental or physical. When citizens stop investing emotionally, states lose resilience. The black market was not rebellion. It was adaptation. It provided what the official economy could not, but also revealed the system's irrelevance. When unofficial channels outperform official ones, legitimacy erodes. The state still claimed control, but control without delivery is fragile. Power rests not on orders, but on outcomes. The shelves proved outcomes were failing. This chapter marks the moment when scarcity stopped being manageable and became systemic. Not dramatic, not sudden, but decisive. The economy crossed a line where fixes required fundamental change. Yet, fundamental change threatened the logic of the system itself. That is the trap. When survival depends on denying reality, reality eventually wins. The Soviet economy did not collapse because people suddenly rejected it. It collapsed because it stopped working in ways that mattered daily. Breakfast, clothing, soap, time. When those fail consistently, ideology cannot compensate. Authority becomes background noise. And once that happens, collapse is no longer a question of if, but when. The shelves told the truth before anyone else did. They spoke through absence, through waiting, through repetition. By the time the message was understood, it was already too late. Collapse rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with sirens or final warnings. It feels ordinary. Another empty store, another delayed shipment, another promise postponed to an unspecified future. By the time political reforms appeared on television screens, the deeper damage had already been done. The economic bond between the state and its people was broken. Trust had drained away quietly over years of waiting. People no longer believed the system could provide, so they stopped protecting it. And a state that is no longer defended in daily life cannot survive on symbols alone. Republics began to look inward. If the center could not deliver food, fuel, or stability, why send resources outward? Local leaders demanded control over production and trade. Workers demanded real wages, not printed assurances. Enterprises sought autonomy, hoping flexibility might succeed where planning failed. Trade networks fractured as regions prioritized themselves. The ruble weakened, then splintered in meaning. Money that once enforced coordination now reflected disintegration. Each adjustment made sense locally. Together, they dissolved the whole. What followed was not just the end of the political structure, but the release of pressure built over decades. Shortages did not disappear overnight. In many places, they worsened before improving. Prices rose sharply. Stability vanished. Security evaporated, but something else returned. Choice. Goods reappeared under a different logic. Not guaranteed, not equal, but responsive. Supply began to answer demand, even when painfully. The transition was harsh, but it exposed the truth the old system had hidden. Control had delayed collapse, not prevented it. The lesson is uncomfortable because it is universal. Empires do not fall only from invasion or revolt. They fall when everyday economics stops making sense, when money cannot command goods, when planning replaces feedback, when citizens spend more time waiting than working. Imagine a modern city where supply chains fail quietly day after day. No alarms, no decorations, just absence. That is how power dissolves, slowly, invisibly, until one day it is gone. The Soviet Union did not collapse because belief vanished overnight. It collapsed because belief became irrational. One empty store at a time, one wasted hour at a time, one broken promise repeated until it meant nothing. The shelves told the story long before the flags came down. They warned that power cannot survive on force and ideology alone. It must function. It must deliver. And when it does not, history moves on without asking permission. If this story changed how you see power, economics, and collapse, subscribe for more deep explorations like this, and share this documentary with others who want to understand how systems really fall.